Hi everybody, and welcome to topic 2 of BAXDC 28943894, Accommodating Minorities in Australia. I'm Paul Michael Donovan, and in this topic we'll be talking about tolerance and toleration and liberalism. First of all, we'll be defining some of these terms. What is liberalism? What does it mean in political terms? It's an interesting one, especially in Australia. And also the significance of tolerance and toleration within liberalism as a political system, as a political paradigm, if you like. We'll be talking about the ramifications of that on things like multiculturalism and how it affects us in our lives. So modern societies within liberal states across the globe have become more increasingly diverse and multicultural over the years. This has lent itself to a peak, if you like, in the interest of liberal philosophers and political theorists studying and thinking about the meaning and the ramifications of this diversity, of this multiculturalism within our society. Societies across the world are often consist of many different identity groups coexisting. So you get a dominant culture, a dominant group within a society, and then within that you get subgroups, people who identify as minorities on the basis of race, religion, gender, or other political nuances that define them as separate or unique or different to the society or culture that they live in. The presence of diverse identities has given rise to this becoming the focus, if you like, of a lot of study and debate and discourse by political theorists about what the best ways are to create an orderly, harmonious society within a multicultural, liberal democratic state such as Australia. Particular attention has been paid to the types of responsibilities that liberal states hold in accommodating and guaranteeing the rights and interests of a range of different minority groups that are founded in modern liberal democracies. These minority groups include those that identify themselves in relation to ethnicity, race, religion, age, gender, sexuality, socioeconomic status, mental and physical capabilities. So in this week's topic, I want to focus on the doctrine of liberalism. Liberalism is important because it's the main political doctrine, the main framework for understanding the moral political bases of, number one, individual rights and freedoms, and number two, the roles of government in protecting and preserving these individual rights and freedoms. So liberalism is a doctrine. It's also important for understanding minority rights in Australia, because Australia is a liberal democratic country. As a liberal democratic state, Australia has certain responsibilities to promote and protect liberal and political principles about the rights and duties of individuals, the rights and duties of governments, and the ideal way that governments should be arranged or organised in order to uphold those rights. So I want to pay some attention to the concept of multiculturalism and the idea of minority or group rights within liberalism. Ideas of liberal multiculturalism have provided a liberal justification for collective minority rights. That is, rights that are given to select groups on the basis of their identity status. In topics 10 and 11, we'll be talking more about multiculturalism as a concept and how it's integral to this unit. So I hope this lecture that it'll become evident the relationship between multiculturalism and liberalism. It's not so straightforward though. In fact, there's a lot of conflict within and problems within the relationships between liberalism and multiculturalism. Richard White describes it as a troubled relationship. Liberalism believes in the primacy of the individual. Individuals hold equal and universal rights, and the concept of universal rights means that any given individual has the same rights as any other. So if one right is given to someone, that same right must be given to everybody else. Multiculturalism, on the other hand, suggests that people in other cultures hold equal rights to respect and dignity, which means that fundamentally we all have those rights, but that our rights should be adapted to make sure that each culture and each community is cared for and looked after appropriately. So within contemporary liberalism, some scholars have suggested that distinct groups in society exist that are entitled to different sets of rights from other groups. Differentiated rights permit greater freedoms for individuals in particular minority groups and assists in preserving distinct cultures and identities where important for the abilities of people to live the good life. And we'll talk more about the good life as we go along. So by having a brief look at liberalism, so when we talk about liberalism, what we're talking about is a political doctrine by which the primary unit of concern is the individual, and individualism, the human rights of each individual person living within a state, and that the state is formed with the rights of each person in mind. So the concern here is not the rights of families, the rights of societies, the rights of governments, the rights of God, the rights of religion. It's about the rights of each individual person and how a state or a nation should best uphold those. It's centered upon the individual. So it's concerned with individual freedoms and rights. This is crucial to liberalism. Because liberalism believes that each person is born free and equal, the state is unable to interfere or shouldn't interfere with that freedom and that equality. So liberalism believes that the state should only exist to promote individual human rights and the capacity of each individual to live freely. And that is to be free to choose how they live their own interpretation of the best way of life possible. This, for example, means that the state has the power and the capacity to create laws and then to enforce them, but only insofar as those laws are designed to uphold the rights of each individual person. So when we talk about human rights, our modern idea of human rights is structured off of the concept of liberal ideas. So the government, for example, can make a rule or a law against murder and then enforce that with the police force and the military, because it's my individual human right as a person not to be murdered. The governments can make laws against, say, theft, for example, because it's my individual right as a human being not to have things stolen from me. The government can enforce these things because they're upholding my individual human rights. The government can't, on the other hand, make a law about, say, for example, religion. The government can't dictate in a liberal democracy what religion its people have to be. On the flip side of that, the government can also not make a law to bar a particular religion from its own state. So liberalism is that each individual person has the right to choose for themselves how they want to live that side of their life, and that the laws are only there to protect them as individuals. So when we talk about liberalism, I said earlier that a lot of Australians get confused about this concept, and rightfully so too. And I found these two charts here, which I think explain pretty well what we mean when we talk about liberalism in terms of the political spectrum. I'm talking first about the scale on the left-hand side of the screen, which is a model of the political ideologies. What you've got here is a left and a right wing. The horizontal axis of this scale is the economic one. So on the far right of that, you've got economic freedom. This is where what we call in Australia the Liberal Party are sitting. The LNP, the Liberal National Party, is an economic right wing. So there are free market capitalists, and then on the far left of that, you've got socialism. So in Australia, that would be the Greens or the Labor Party. on the left. So when we talk about liberalism, what we mean politically is the liberals on the left. So it's a confusing thing in Australia, because when we say liberal in Australia, usually we're talking about the political right wing. And the reason why they're called liberal is because it's not about social liberalism that we're talking about here in this lecture. The Liberal Party is about economic liberalism. The word liberal itself comes from liberty, liberty meaning freedom. So what you see on the right of the scale there, you've got economic freedom, economic liberty. What that means is that the government doesn't interfere with people's ability to make a profit. Not as much people though, more businesses and companies and corporations and their capacity to make a profit. So for example, the economic freedom for the right-wing government would be focused on making it more possible for big companies to do things like not pay as much tax, or implementing trade agreements that would facilitate and assist them with making a profit. On the left of that scale, you've got economic equality. So the far left, the extreme of that would be communism, where in theory the government owns all of the money and then divvies it out on a theoretically equal basis among its populace. So in communism, people don't have that freedom to make as much or as little profit as they like and to become richer or poorer, whereas in economic freedom you have that. Then when we look at the vertical axis in the middle of the screen, you've got traditional at the top and progressive at the bottom. So in traditional, at the top end of that spectrum, it's mirrored on the other chart with tyranny. So at the top of that social equality spectrum, what you've got is that the government are completely in charge of social life. So the government would be in charge of things like public beliefs and public education. It's interesting to look at things like North Korea as an example, where Kim Jong-il can make statements like that he was the first man on the moon or various other things, and have those planted into the education system. So that's absolute control. The opposite of that is progressivism, and you push that scale into its extreme, and what you've got on that social scale is anarchy. So that's how much or how little control the government has over its people. On the top end with tyranny, that's a lot of control. On the bottom end with anarchy, that's a government that has no control. So that people are free as individuals and as communities to make up their own decisions and their own laws and to live without any control of the government. So you've got a political spectrum of a social and of an economic basis. And the reason why we get confused about this in Australia is because our right wing is called the Liberal Party. What we're talking about here when we say liberal is down there on the left. So economic equality and progressivism. A government which is democratic but is also ruled by liberal ideologies. Socially liberal. So our ideas of human rights and liberalism have their foundations in Greek philosophy. We talk about Aristotle and his idea of the good life, the Aristotelian idea of eudaimonia, which is a flourishing, a contented state of being happy, healthy and prosperous. And when we said before about the idea of a liberal state being only allowed to make laws insofar as they uphold or defend or protect human rights, this is essentially what those human rights are. The right of each person to be happy, healthy and prosperous. And only insofar as a law is designed to do that can it be implemented into a liberal state. So liberalism believes that individuals possess the reason and the capacity to be able to think for themselves and decide for themselves what their interpretation of the good life is, what their belief of the good life should be. And the decisions that they make on those terms are in their control, not in the control of a state. When we think, for example, of parts of history where the state have been in control over those kinds of things, we very quickly start to see why the definition of human rights comes about now as it does. So if you think about, say, the Nazis, for example, the reign of terror during the French Revolution, or even the Spanish Inquisition, the state had the capacity to send agents around to your door, knock on your door, ask you a list of questions about what you believe, and if you answered incorrectly, they had the power to execute you. It's a human right under a liberal state that you should be able to make those decisions for yourself, what you believe. And it's not the place of the state to interfere in those things. So some theorists have argued that the central virtue of liberalism is toleration, which can be defined as the peaceful coexistence of different groups within a society. Toleration is necessary within a society comprising different groups of people with different histories, cultures, and identities. Social order could not be maintained if we didn't or couldn't accommodate, accept, and recognise difference. Toleration rejects the idea that a state can legitimately deny an individual's rights to live their life according to their culture, their religious or social beliefs. One of the first liberal thinkers to articulate an idea such as this was John Locke. Locke's A Letter Concerning Toleration defended religious toleration between different denominations of Christianity. He wrote some very influential works in the late 17th century, around the same time that England was being torn apart by the religious conflicts of their civil wars between Catholics and Protestants. His ideas of religious toleration emerged as a response to the conflicts that he'd seen occurring between the two different religious groups within the one nation. Locke suggested that the citizen had neutral rights that the government could not take away from them, and that if they did, then the citizens have a right to withdraw their consent of that government. The concept of natural rights, developed by scholars in philosophy across thousands of years, is the antecedent of the modern ideas that we now have as human rights. So Locke's concern was about how best to create a stable society when people within it hold diverse views. The key to peaceful coexistence, according to Locke, was for people to tolerate the presence of diverse religions within society. Not necessarily to like or approve of those religions, but just to recognise the rights of individuals to choose a religion, bearing in mind that at this stage toleration was mainly centred upon Christian denominations. Locke argued that tolerating difference was the only way of achieving social order, but this early form of liberal toleration tends to convey negative feelings towards that which is being tolerated. So, early views on tolerations reflected a resigned acceptance of difference, born of exhaustion from groups trying to kill each other. Other liberal philosophers developed Locke's ideas. So, for example, John Stuart Mill wrote his essay on liberty, that no individual is accountable to others for his religious beliefs. Mill was very important for the formation of the modern ideas that we now have in our human rights. Along with Jeremy Bentham, these people believed that rights and liberties were essential because they believed that people have the right to pursue happiness. They had the right to pursue the good life, so that eudaimonia that we talked about earlier. This idea continues to have resonance and in contemporary ideas of toleration. So liberalism is justified as a system that enables individual happiness. As the liberal utilitarians said, a central liberal goal should be the greatest happiness for the greatest number. These early views of toleration came to have a broader meaning as toleration has been extended to non-religious spheres. Now, we also include other collective identity groups within the concept of toleration. So, for example, in particular, culture, race, ethnicity, gender, disability, age, sexuality, so on, so on, so on. And we'll deal with all of those throughout the course of this course. So proponents of modern liberalism believe that the liberal state must respect the rights of individuals to pursue their different understandings of the good life. This is dealt with in your Hindus reading for this week. Now, the idea is that people cannot be free unless they're able to live in the ways that they want to. So personal freedom involves being able to choose how we live, what we believe, what religion we practice, and what cultural traditions we choose to uphold. These rights and freedoms are widespread in liberal democracies and are well acknowledged within international human rights law. These rights and freedoms are widespread and well acknowledged within the international human rights law, which is largely based upon liberal principles. The 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, for example, compels states to ensure that all individuals are equal before the law and entitled without any discrimination to equal protection of the law based upon liberal principles of equality and anti-discrimination. Secondly, that everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience and religion. So individuals have the right to choose their religion and to change religions if they want to. Thirdly, that everyone has the right to freely participate in the cultural life of the community, so individuals hold basic cultural rights, the capacity to also participate in cultural practices. Australia is a liberal democracy, which means subscribing in principle to these ideas and individual rights. It's for this reason that in the Australian Constitution it explicitly states that we don't have a particular religion. That Australia is, for all intents and purposes, a non-religious country. That doesn't always pan out as it is on paper, because things like when you go to court, you have to swear on a Bible, different rituals through things like Remembrance Day and Australia Day. A lot of our nationalism is very strongly tied to Christianity because of our roots coming out of the British Empire in the 19th century. But strictly speaking, in black and white, Australia is a nation without a religion. It's a liberal democracy. Individual freedoms and anti-discrimination, although turning abstract rights into concrete law and policy can be tricky, there are many debates in Australia at the moment that deal with issues of tolerance, inclusion and discrimination. I want to try and find as many of those debates as we can through the media and our popular culture before the end of this course, and just give everyone a good opportunity to engage with those and talk about them, to get a better understanding of where we're at as Australians with those things. So accommodating minorities is important to liberal theory because cultural and social group identities are important to individuals. People tend to enjoy holding particularized identities and participating in distinct cultural practices or regimes. So people tend to reject homogeneity or what we would call sameness. And you see that right throughout Australian culture. People who identify with a whole variety of different religions and backgrounds and cultures and ethnicities will still be able to stand together and say, I am Australian, even though I happen to be Greek or Chinese or Irish or Italian. I'm still Australian, and we're all together on that. So when we talk about toleration as an attitude, I've brought up this quote from Thomas Jefferson, not because it directly relates to Australia, but just because it describes really nicely the kind of concept that we're dealing with here. Thomas Jefferson said, and I quote, "It does me no injury for my neighbour to say that there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg." So what do we mean when we say toleration? We tolerate when we do not attempt to suppress that which we dislike or disapprove. The phrase toleration, or to tolerate itself, doesn't exactly suggest excitement at the idea of sharing civil space with those who we perceive or understand as different from ourselves. So the most pragmatic way to justify toleration, according to Samuel Scheffler, who's one of your readings for this week, is by viewing it as a strategic compromise, if you like. Mutual tolerance of difference is perceived as the best that can be hoped for in plural societies under this worldview. He argues that toleration can entail a resigned acceptance of difference for the sake of peace, or it can mean a passive indifference towards diversity. Like to say, I don't necessarily like you, but I'm prepared to not fight you for the sake of us both living comfortably. So this suggests that ways people live are private, that things like religious and cultural practices and beliefs belong in the private sphere, that they should be no concern of others in society and no concern of the government. So some of you might recognise this as reflecting the public/private spheres. That's a key theme in liberal theory, which suggests that the public realm, that is to say government and civil society, has no right to interfere with the private realm. So what people do at home in their own lives, that doesn't hurt anybody else. But toleration also means a principled recognition that people do have cultural rights. So how do we create an inclusive, tolerant society that permits individual freedoms and rights? The philosopher John Rawls argues that the most pressing issue facing modern liberal democracies, such as Australia, is maintaining a legitimate stability in societies where deep and irreconcilable social and cultural cleavages exist across moral, religious, ethnic or linguistic fault lines. Over time, liberal toleration is manifested in a couple of ways. Firstly, that the state does not have the right to enforce a religion or cultural beliefs upon its citizens. And secondly, that the state must actively protect cultural rights of citizens through multicultural policies and positive discrimination. The first idea is that the state doesn't have the right to enforce a religion or cultural beliefs upon its citizens. This is found in older forms of liberalism. So people have the right to choose their religion and their culture. Enforcing a religion upon people undermines their basic human rights. So it's incompatible with the fundamental tenets of liberalism. This is commonly expressed in the concept of secularism, which is the idea that the church should be separated from the state. Our contemporary ideas on liberalism emerged from a belief that the state cannot interfere with the religious beliefs of individuals, and that individuals should be free to choose their religion or to choose no religion. So back to the Thomas Jefferson quote. So here the principle of secularism makes it clear that a majority or dominant cultural or religious groups cannot expect minority groups to conform to an official state religion. In Australia, the state does not have the right to enforce Christianity upon its citizens. There is no official religion, although in some instances the dominance of Christianity in Australia is still apparent. So I said before, putting your hand on the Bible, etc., etc. There was a culture up until fairly recently where state schools offered religious instruction as a compulsory part of the curriculum, or that it was something that parents had to specifically opt out of if they objected to it. That's more recently been changed so that if parents wish for their students, their own children, to be educated in religion, they have to specifically request that. So it's more in keeping with a liberal mindset of separation of religion and state. In some non-liberal states, such as Islamic ones, for example, Iran, Pakistan, Islam is not only the religion of that nation, it's also the law of that nation. So, for example, the state has control over things like how people dress, how they have relationships, different parts of their social and cultural lives based upon the tenets and laws of their particular religion. The official religion in those countries is Islam, and all of the citizens are expected to conform. So they're expected to become Muslims in order to be able to live in those states. In other words, there's no separation between church and state because they're intertwined in ways that are not acceptable to liberal societies. Ideas of liberal toleration have evolved alongside a growing belief in what we call cultural relativism. This is a belief that there is no objective way of thinking to know whether or not one way of life is better necessarily than others. So there's no legitimate basis for intolerance, that there is no superior or inferior cultures. there's a quote at the top of the screen from Michel Foucault, not better, not worse, just different. The fundamental idea of cultural relativism is that all cultures are ostensibly different versions of the same ideas, and that ideas can often be translated across cultures from one to the next. So a way of life that seems foreign or different to your own might actually just be another way of looking at the exact same concept. In other words, the subjective nature of social and cultural identities means that there's no right or wrong, there's no better or worse, so attempting to force a religion or culture upon a person against their will is unjustifiable. In this view, we cannot reasonably condemn or persecute or discriminate against people for holding different religious or cultural beliefs because they're subjective, and there's no way of rationally arguing, for example, that Catholicism is more a legitimate religion than Protestantism or vice versa. As Valser argues, our experiences and our opinions and our beliefs are always necessarily culturally mediated. The things we take for granted as right or wrong, moral or immoral and so forth are determined by our social context, by our own history, by our own upbringing, our own culture, and so on and so forth. So we all come at things from a different perspective. Cultural relativism holds that when it comes to morality, there are no universal truths. For our own concept of toleration, it means that no one group has the right to suppress the religious or cultural practices and beliefs of another group. Assimilation and the imposition of culture upon a people, or the repression of cultural rights, restricts the abilities of minorities and marginalised groups or disadvantaged groups to live the good life by their own understanding of their own eudaimonia, their own understanding of their own happiness and prosperity, according to how they see fit in their own worldview. So we're back to this basic idea that individuals cannot be fully free, and if they're unable to pursue that happiness according to their own personal understanding of the good life. So because liberalism is something that comprises a diversity of different ideologies and different theories, there are some inherent tensions within it, ways that it's not entirely as cohesive as we might be tempted to think. Liberal democratic theory relies on concept of citizenship to explain the relationships between people and states, and to outline the rights and responsibilities of citizens and governments. Individuals are generally acknowledged to have the same rights and responsibilities because key beliefs of liberalism are individualism and equality. So that if what's good for the goose should also be good for the gander, so to speak. This makes liberal democracies different from other political systems. One class of people should not have a better set of rights and privileges than other groups of people. And conversely, one group should not effectively have a greater set of burdens or obligations to the state. Liberal conceptions of citizenship are based primarily on egalitarian conceptions of individual rights. A large reason for this is because the societies that gave us what we now have as modern liberalism came out of experiences like the idea of the collapse of feudalism, where some people were inherently peasants and others were inherently kings. And there was an inequality inherent in that system. They came out of contexts where they'd seen slavery rise and fall, and wanted to do something to alleviate that, to bring equality and justice into a new system, into a new way of life. So there's a lot of different perspectives and different opinions on what gave us liberalism in this way. So liberal conceptions of citizenship are based primarily on these ideas of egalitarianism, that we're all equal as individuals. Liberalism privileges the individual above groups, and we see this in the liberal conception of the universal basic human rights that are inalienable and exist regardless of other group affiliations that individuals hold. So there are two concepts of equality that exist in liberalism. One is the equality of treatment, which is called pure liberalism. This is the idea that all citizens have the same rights and the same responsibilities. This is most commonly found in ideas of universal citizenship. So regardless of personal circumstance or identity or levels of disadvantage, all people should have access to identical sets of rights. The second concept, the one that is in friction to the first, is the equality of opportunity, where all citizens should have equal opportunity to seek happiness and pursue the good life, and that this might require positive discrimination to assist people who may have been disadvantaged by the state. Here, rights may be accorded so that the nature of individual rights may vary depending on the particular cultural community to which they belong. So we call those differentiated rights. According to this view, cultural life can be preserved and disadvantage overcome if differentiated rights are granted according to the identity rather than universal models of citizenship. These are more likely to be found in democratic political models like Australia and in some Western European states to a much greater extent, Scandinavia. We see these manifesting in things like our state implementing structures and procedures whereby Indigenous people are given extra help or encouraged to take places in university or assisted to do so because there's an inherent inequality. So the government has then taken steps to balance those inequalities out, to close the gap, so to speak, by adding opportunities in communities that lack them. So helping according to need rather than giving the same amount of help to each. We can see some forms of positive discrimination, for example, in these kinds of policies. Indigenous people getting into universities in order to overcome systemic disadvantage that is perpetuated through a history of negative discrimination. So it's about trying to balance out the bad discrimination by putting some positive steps in force. Moreover, we see welfare rights are often justified on the basis of equality and opportunity. To paraphrase Aristotle, treating unequal people equally only perpetuates their inequality. However, those who believe in the universal citizenship believe that differentiated rights involve trespassing on the rights of others. That, why should another person get help that I don't get just because they're disadvantaged? In other words, that any form of discrimination, positive or negative, infringes on the liberal principles of freedom and equality. We can describe this tension as a debate between particular universal concepts of citizenship. Liberalism has traditionally been hostile to the idea of groups claiming collective rights, given their emphasis on individuals. And this is seen to be respecting or privileging group rights more than individual rights. Universal citizenship has it that all laws and rules are the same for all, and they apply to all in the same way. This is described as pure liberalism, where the concept of equality is taken to mean that everybody is treated equally, regardless of their personal circumstances, identity, or status. There's been contemporary backlash against this universalist approach in modern liberalism, as Iris Marion Young, Will Kymlicka, and other liberal theorists have argued. The principle of universal citizenship and equal treatment for all perpetuates oppression and disadvantage. So differentiated citizenship is hence required to promote the inclusion and participation of all people in social and political institutions, as it promotes a much deeper form of toleration than was envisaged by the early liberal thinkers. In essence, there's a belief that some groups should have special rights in order to rectify previous disadvantages. The liberal commitment to respect individuals' rights and freedoms in a liberal society means that in some cases there is a need to recognise that members of some groups deserve or require special rights in order to achieve equality in opportunity, in order to equalise the lives and chances of individuals. So of course we should recognise that there are boundaries to tolerance. Toleration says that liberal democracy should not permit negative discrimination against people on the basis of social group or towards identity. The real question is, how do we come to an agreement about what to tolerate and what not to tolerate? Drawing these boundaries is often difficult, precisely because citizens in liberal democracies hold different viewpoints. It's the drawing up of the boundaries of tolerance and intolerance, and inclusion and exclusion, that prevent liberal democracy from more closely approximating the ideal vision of society that underpins liberal toleration and liberal multiculturalism. It's because we all come from different cultural, religious, and ethnic and philosophical viewpoints that reaching consensus on what practices should be accommodated and not accommodated are so problematic. Kwame Anthony Appiah argues that we cannot understand the idea of tolerance if we can't identify what is not tolerable. In other words, there are practices that cannot be tolerated. And this, again, is an inherent part of living within a liberal democratic society. It's simply not possible for each person to just do whatever he wants, because we live in a society where we don't tolerate murder or rape or domestic violence, for example. But there are much more complex issues around cultural rights. For example, do liberal democratic societies choose to make female genital mutilation illegal while male circumcision is still legal? Our ideas of liberal toleration are not cut and dry, but we have to come to terms with the basics. The argument of liberal democracies that we cannot claim to uphold the values of freedom and equality if they negatively discriminate against people on the basis of their social status. I want to take this further in the discussions once everybody's had a good look at the readings for this week, and once we've found some media and some pop culture that we can sort of bring to the table to talk about. I'd really love to unpack this as a group. So I'm looking really forward to speaking to everyone in the discussions this week. Thanks for listening.